Have you ever wondered how close you've come to danger without even realizing it? At Shivering Vault, we take you there, one story at a time. But before you drift off, consider liking this video, commenting where you're watching from and at what time, and subscribing to keep these chilling stories coming. Now, let's dive into these unsettling tales. I don't know where to even begin with this story. It feels almost impossible to explain, like something out of a bad dream. But I promise you, every word of this is true. It's one of those experiences that, no matter how hard I try to shake it off, still lingers with me like a shadow, reminding me of how fragile our sense of security can really be. I've told a few people about it, but honestly, I'm not sure anyone believes me. I still don't know if I fully believe it myself. Anyway, let me introduce myself first. My name's Smith. I'm a 23-year-old software developer living in a small house in a quiet area outside of Austin, Texas. It's not much, just a little house on the outskirts of town. The neighborhood is quiet enough to where I can hear the rustling of trees and the chirping of crickets in the evenings, but there's always a sense of isolation here. A part of me loves the peace, but sometimes the silence feels a little too heavy, like it's waiting for something to break it. Maybe that's why I wasn't bothered when I first moved in alone. I figured I'd get used to it. My home is modest, a 2-bedroom, 1-bathroom house that's small but has a lot of charm. Nothing extravagant, just a place to crash after a long day at work. My job isn't glamorous. I work from home, coding most days, making sure software runs the way it's supposed to. My days are usually filled with staring at lines of code breaking things down, testing, and fixing bugs. It can be exhausting, but it pays the bills. Most of my interactions are with my computer and the occasional email exchange with my coworkers. The best part about it? I get to work in my pajamas. I live pretty much like any other guy my age would. I don't have a ton of friends, but I have Daniel, my best friend since high school. Daniel's the kind of guy who's always up for anything, and we both share a love of video games and pizza. So when he suggested coming over to my place for a sleepover one Friday night, I was all for it. We hadn't had one of our all-night gaming marathons in a while, and I was definitely in the mood for some downtime. That night, we kicked things off around 9 p.m. The house was still hot from the Texas summer heat, despite the air conditioning running at full blast. The sun had just set, but the warm orange glow from the fading daylight still lingered through the windows. We cracked open a couple of cold beers, turned on the TV, and popped in one of the new games we had been dying to try. The living room was dark, except for the glow from the TV and the dim lights from the kitchen. The furniture was old, mismatched, leather couches that had seen better days, and a coffee table covered in old snack wrappers and empty cans. But it was comfortable enough. It wasn't long before we decided it was time to order food. We'd been playing for a couple of hours and were getting hungry. We both had a craving for pizza, so I pulled out my phone and went to the app for a local place we'd tried before. It was a small, family-run pizzeria in town, just a few miles away. Their pizzas weren't the best I'd ever had, but they were solid, cheesy, greasy, the kind of pizza that hits the spot when you're having a late-night gaming session. I ordered 2 large pizzas, 1 pepperoni and 1 supreme, and waited. The order went through quickly, and it gave us just enough time to set up the next round of games. The minutes ticked by, and the conversation between Daniel and me started to get a little more lively. We were catching up on everything: work, relationships, random life stuff. The house felt comfortable, and despite the heat, it was the kind of night that made me forget about the world outside. It wasn't until around 11 p.m. that I got the notification that our pizza was on its way. I hadn't expected it to be so fast, but I figured the delivery guy must have been close by. Daniel and I continued chatting as we waited. The hours seem to slip by faster than you realize when you're engrossed in a conversation, and the next thing I knew, there was a sharp knock at the door. I glanced at Daniel, then to the clock. "That was quick," I muttered, rising from the couch. "Yeah, must be some kind of speedster," Daniel joked. I headed for the door and pulled it open, and that's when I first saw him, the delivery guy. He was standing there, holding 2 pizza boxes, his posture slightly stiff, his face expressionless. He was tall, probably around 6'3", with a scruffy, unkempt beard. He wore the usual pizza delivery uniform, black polo shirt with the logo of the pizzeria on it, khaki pants, and a delivery bag slung over one shoulder. But there was something off about him. I couldn't put my finger on it right away, but the moment I looked at him, I felt a little unsettled. "Pizza for Smith?" he asked, his voice a little lower than I expected. He spoke almost too softly, like he was trying to avoid making too much noise. "Yeah, that's me," I replied, trying to sound casual. "Thanks for getting it here so fast." He handed me the boxes, but instead of letting go of them right away, he paused. His eyes shifted over my shoulder, glancing into the house. I thought it was a bit odd, but I didn't think much of it. Sometimes people are just curious, right? I glanced back at Daniel, who had gotten up to join me at the door. The guy didn't seem to notice him. Instead, his eyes flicked back to me, his gaze just a little too intense. "Is anyone else here with you?" he asked. His tone wasn't accusatory, but there was something strange about it. It almost sounded like he was making sure of something. I blinked, taken aback by the question. Yeah, my buddy Daniel," I said, gesturing behind me. Daniel waved in the background, clearly confused about what was going on. "Why?" The delivery guy didn't respond right away. His eyes continued to scan the room, then flicked back to me. "Just making sure," he muttered under his breath. I raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean, making sure?" He didn't explain. Instead, he shifted slightly on his feet and asked again, "Are you sure it's just you two?" Something in my gut twisted. There was no reason for him to ask these questions. I felt a strange sense of discomfort beginning to settle over me, but I shrugged it off, chalking it up to him just being an odd delivery driver. "Yeah, man, it's just us," I said, trying to laugh it off. He nodded slowly, almost like he was satisfied with my answer. But then, just as I was about to step back inside and close the door, he spoke again. "I just need to make sure," he said, and before I could react, he pushed himself forward, and then his shoulder brushing against the doorframe. I froze. Excuse me?" I said, startled. "What are you doing?" "Just making sure you're alone," he repeated, his voice now lower, almost to a whisper. Before I knew it, his body was pressing against the door. I tried to push back, but he wasn't budging. He didn't seem physically intimidating at first, but his presence was oddly overpowering, like he was trying to take control of the situation. My heart started pounding. I glanced back at Daniel, who was now staring at the scene with a look of disbelief. "Dude, what the hell?" Daniel said, stepping forward. That's when I felt the unmistakable, unsettling shift. The delivery guy's eyes weren't scanning the room just out of curiosity anymore. He was focused, intent on something, and the way his hands slowly moved toward his jacket, toward something tucked inside it, sent a wave of panic through me. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice shaking now. The delivery guy didn't answer. Instead, his eyes locked with mine, cold and unwavering. There was something deeply unsettling about that look, like he wasn't here to deliver pizza at all. He was here for something else. I didn't know if he was a burglar or just some crazy person who had stolen a uniform, but I could feel in my gut that I needed to get the door shut. Now, I slammed the door forward, but it didn't close all the way. His shoulder was still lodged against it, and with a force I didn't expect, he pushed back harder. I stumbled backwards, my heart racing. Daniel shouted from behind me, but I couldn't take my eyes off the delivery guy's hand. He was gripping something metallic. "Get away from the door!" I screamed, finally realizing the danger. I pressed all my weight against the door, trying to shut it, but his force was too much. It was like he was trying to force his way inside. That's when I realized this wasn't about pizza. My heart raced, pounding in my chest like it might explode. The weight of the situation settled on me all at once. This wasn't a delivery. This was a threat. "Smith, what the hell is going on?" Daniel shouted, his voice strained with panic as he backed up, putting more distance between himself and the door. I could hear his phone already being fumbled in his hands, no doubt dialing 911. "Get away from the door," I repeated, my hands trembling as I pressed with all my strength against the wooden surface, trying to close it. But the delivery guy didn't budge. It felt like he was a brick wall, refusing to be moved. I glanced quickly at Daniel. His face was pale, eyes wide with shock. "I'm calling the cops. Just keep him out of the house," he yelled, his voice cracking. The delivery guy's eyes narrowed, his expression growing darker as he shifted his weight, pushing harder against the door. I realized then that he wasn't just trying to get in, he was trying to break me. Fear flooded my veins. My mind raced. I needed to end this now. I couldn't let him inside, couldn't let him get any closer. With one last burst of strength, I shoved the door with everything I had. The door slammed shut with a sickening thud, and for a moment, everything went still. I held my breath, my hands pressed against the wood. But just as I thought I had him locked out, I heard him speak. His voice was low, almost a growl. "Don't think this is over. I'll be back." I didn't wait for him to say anything else. My heart was pounding in my ears, and adrenaline made my legs weak. I stumbled back from the door, gasping for air as I motioned for Daniel to move toward the back of the house. We needed to get away from the front door, get somewhere safe. We rushed to the kitchen, where Daniel frantically dialed 911. I could hear him giving our address, trying to stay calm, but I could tell he was as shaken as I was. As soon as he hung up, I heard the faint sound of footsteps on the porch again. The delivery guy was still out there. "Did you hear that?" I whispered, my voice shaking. Daniel nodded, his face pale. "We need to lock all the doors, now." I rushed to the back door, locking it tight. The windows were next. I checked each one, double-checking the locks. It was like I was moving in slow motion, but my body was trembling so hard it felt like I was on autopilot. Suddenly, there was a loud knock at the back door. "Stay quiet," Daniel whispered, grabbing my arm. His grip was firm, but I could tell he was just as terrified as I was. "We need to stay hidden. The cops are on their way. They'll get here soon." But I couldn't shake the feeling that the delivery guy wasn't just here to scare us. He was here to hunt. We crept to the living room, staying as far from the windows and doors as we could. We sat in silence, barely breathing, waiting for any sign of movement, any noise that would give us a clue as to what the hell was going on. Minutes stretched into hours. It felt like time had stopped. The sound of crickets outside had faded, and in its place there was an eerie stillness. Every little creak of the house, every gust of wind against the windows felt like an alarm, a signal that the delivery guy was still out there. And then, finally, we heard the sirens, the sound of distant police cars coming to our rescue. But the delivery guy didn't make a sound. By the time the police arrived, we were too terrified to open the door, but we finally did. The house was eerily quiet, save for our frantic breaths and the steady thrum of our pounding hearts. The cops scoured the house, checked the backyard, and looked around the perimeter, but there was no sign of the delivery guy. He had vanished. They checked the street, checked the neighborhood. Nothing. He was gone. It was as if he had never been there at all. I didn't sleep that night. The police said they'd patrol the area, but they didn't have much to go on. No ID, no details on who the guy really was, just a creepy delivery driver with a uniform. The next day, I went to the pizzeria. I needed answers. When I asked about the delivery driver, the manager gave me a confused look. "We don't have anyone working here who fits that description. You sure it was one of our drivers?" she asked. I felt my stomach turn. The person who had knocked on my door wasn't even a delivery driver. He was a stranger, someone who had gotten a hold of a uniform and who had almost crossed a terrifying line. That thought still haunts me. To this day, I don't know what he was really after, or why he chose me. Was it random, or did he have a specific reason for targeting me? I've since moved to a new place. I couldn't stay in that house, not after everything that happened. But every time I hear a knock at the door, my heart still skips a beat, and I can't help but wonder, what if he's still out there? It's funny how life sometimes pushes you into the most terrifying situations when you least expect it. The kind of moments where everything feels normal until it doesn't. You've probably had one of those days where you think you're safe, just going about your business, and then, bam, something changes, something shifts. That's exactly what happened to me and my friend Will the night we decided to explore the old construction site on the outskirts of town. Let me start with who I am. My name's Mark. I've been living in Texas for the past year, working as a mechanic at a small family-owned shop in the town of Odessa. The shop is nothing special, just a small building tucked between two much bigger ones with a faded sign that reads Jim's Auto Repair in peeling letters. I don't mind it though, it's honest work. I mostly deal with fixing old trucks and cars, everything from oil changes to engine repairs. It's a quiet, low-key job. I don't make a lot of money, but it's enough to pay the bills, and that's all I really need right now. The thing is, though, I never really felt at home in this town. It's not like there's anything wrong with it. Odessa is just one of those places where you either settle in or you leave. Some days it felt like I was just passing through, waiting for something interesting to happen. It was on one of these quiet days that I met Will. Will wasn't like me. He wasn't the type to sit back and wait for things to happen. He was the kind of guy who needed adventure, who thrived on it. I'd met him a few months ago at a bar after work. He was one of those guys who could walk into a room and immediately make you feel like you were the only other person there. A bit cocky, a lot charming, and never short of ideas. He worked as a construction worker during the day, always in and out of odd jobs around town. Will had a habit of dragging me into his wild ideas. It wasn't that I was scared of the things he suggested, but more that I liked the quiet. I preferred my routine. But somehow, Will always managed to talk me into going along with whatever crazy thing he'd come up with. One night, he suggested we check out the old construction site on the edge of town. The place had been abandoned for months. From what I'd heard, it had once been a project to build a new apartment complex, but for whatever reason, it was left unfinished. No one had worked there in ages. At first, I didn't want to go. I mean, it was a construction site. It was dark. It was isolated. But Will, being Will, wasn't going to let me off easy. "Come on, man," he said, with that grin that always got to me. "What's the worst that could happen?" Now, I should have known better. After all, I wasn't exactly an adrenaline junkie like Will. I was more of the type to stay in, watch a movie, and sip on a beer. But that night I didn't want to seem like a coward, so I agreed. Big mistake. We set out at about 10 p.m. It wasn't particularly late, but the air had a strange quality to it. The night was warm for February, and there was a heaviness in the air, like the atmosphere itself was thick with something unseen. The moon hung high, casting pale light over everything, making the night seem almost dreamlike. As we drove out of town in my old Chevy, the sound of the engine rattling against the worn-out pavement seemed louder than usual. I couldn't quite shake the feeling that something was off, but I didn't say anything to Will. When we finally arrived at the construction site, the first thing I noticed was the silence. The air was completely still. There wasn't even a breeze to stir the dry grass that grew in patches along the fence. The only sound was the crunch of gravel beneath our boots as we stepped out of the truck. The site itself was surrounded by a rusted chain-link fence that looked like it hadn't been maintained in years. Some of the links were bent or broken, and gaps had formed where the fence had caved in. Beyond it, the skeletal remains of half-built buildings loomed in the distance, their sharp edges like jagged teeth against the dark sky. It was strange. The site was so big, but there was no sign of life. Not a single worker, not a single vehicle. Nothing. "Come on," Will said, his voice breaking through my thoughts. He was already halfway through the gap in the fence, eager to explore. I hesitated for a moment, but then followed. My steps were slower, more cautious. Something didn't feel right, but I tried to push it out of my mind. We wandered through the site, stepping over piles of debris and making our way toward the unfinished buildings. The air smelled musty, like wet concrete and old metal. The faint scent of oil and rust hung in the air, lingering around us. The buildings looked like they were in the middle of being constructed, exposed beams and half-constructed walls, piles of materials strewn about. I remember seeing an old forklift sitting abandoned in a corner, its tires deflated and rusted from disuse. "Dude, check this out," Will called from inside one of the structures. I walked over to him, glancing around the dark space. The room was huge, the frame of the building still open to the sky above. The floor was littered with scattered construction tools, hammers, screws, wrenches, things that seemed to have been left behind in a hurry. The walls were covered in faded blueprints, curling at the edges as if they hadn't been touched in years. I leaned over to look at what Will had found, an old, half-scribbled note on the floor. It looked like someone had dropped it during the middle of the project, a torn piece of paper that seemed so out of place. But Will didn't seem interested in the note. He was already moving deeper into the building. "I think there's something in here," he said, excitement in his voice. I wasn't so sure. I glanced around, feeling the uneasy feeling grow in my chest. It was that feeling, the one you get when you know something's wrong, even though you can't put your finger on it. "Will, maybe we should head out. It's getting late," I said, trying to sound casual, but the tremor in my voice betrayed me. But Will, of course, didn't listen. "Relax. It's fine. I'm just looking around. You stay here if you want." I stood there for a moment, watching him disappear into the shadows of the building. Something about his presence made the whole place feel even more oppressive, like we were intruding on something that was never meant to be disturbed. But I didn't want to be left alone, so I followed him deeper into the site. That's when it happened. A rustling noise broke the silence. It was so quiet at first that I almost thought it was the wind. But then it came again. Louder. Closer. "Will," I whispered, my voice tight. He didn't hear me. He was too busy poking around the debris. The noise got louder, closer, and suddenly I was sure it wasn't the wind. Something or someone was out there. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. My breath came faster, sharper. I needed to get out. My instincts were screaming at me to run. "Will," I said, this time louder, but still no response. I turned toward the direction of the noise, my eyes scanning the darkness, and then I saw him. At first I thought it was just a shadow, but then I realized it was a figure, someone standing in the distance, barely visible in the dim light. A man. My heart stopped. The man didn't move at first. He was just standing there, staring at us, or maybe just at me. The more I looked at him, the more I could tell something wasn't right. His clothes were tattered, like he had been living out there for a while. His skin was pale, almost sickly, and there was something unsettling about the way he stood. He didn't seem human, too still, too rigid. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move, and then he started walking. Slowly at first, but then faster, as if he had made up his mind. He wasn't walking toward Will, though. He was heading straight toward me. I turned and bolted, not thinking, not caring about anything except getting away from him. I could hear his footsteps behind me, getting closer, faster, and then he was running. I don't remember how I got out of the building, but I remember the sound of his breath, ragged, desperate, like he was hunting me. I reached the clearing, nearly tripping over the uneven ground, my heart pounding in my chest. I glanced back to see Will finally catching up with me, his face pale and wide-eyed with confusion. That's when the man caught up. I felt his hand on my shoulder, grabbing me, yanking me back to the ground. I crashed hard onto the dirt, gasping for air. The man was on top of me in an instant, his grip tight around my wrist, trying to rip my phone from my pocket. My mind raced. I kicked and punched, trying to break free, but his grip was unnaturally strong. I didn't know how much longer I could hold out. Will must have seen what was happening because I heard him scream, and then he was there, pushing the man off me, pulling me to my feet. We didn't look back. We didn't say anything. We just ran, full speed, toward the truck, my hands shaking as I fumbled for the keys. We drove back to town without saying a word, the silence heavy between us. My heart still raced, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we had narrowly escaped something far worse. I don't know who that man was or why he was there. All I know is he wasn't some random person wandering through the site. He was hiding there, waiting. And I don't think he was done with us. I still think about that night sometimes. The silence of the construction site, the man who almost caught me. Sometimes I wonder if I'll ever feel truly safe again. My name's Caleb. I'm a pretty ordinary guy, about 28 years old, living on my own in a modest house in the middle of Texas. It's a small town, not much more than a handful of streets and a couple of convenience stores. I've lived here for most of my life. My job isn't anything special either. I work at a warehouse, loading and unloading shipments. It's physically demanding, but it's simple work, just the kind of thing I've always done. The pay's decent, and the hours aren't bad, so I make enough to get by. I don't really have any big ambitions. I get by. That's all. But sometimes when I'm home alone at night, the stillness of the house gets to me. I don't know what it is about this place. It's not like it's haunted or anything, and it's not like I've had any particularly creepy experiences here. It's just that sometimes I feel watched. Maybe it's just the isolation. There's no one around for miles except the occasional car passing by. It's the kind of town where you can hear the crickets at night, the hum of the streetlights. You're never really alone, but you are. The house itself is old, really old. It's a 2-story red brick house with white shutters that have chipped paint. The yard has patches of overgrown grass and weeds, and the driveway's cracked and worn out. The inside of the house is mostly the same, worn wooden floors, old furniture, and the kind of smells you get from a house that's been standing for decades. My parents didn't renovate much when they lived here. I don't either. There's something comforting about it, though. It's my home, for better or worse. My room is on the second floor at the far end of the hallway. It's small, with a low bed covered in plain blankets. The walls are a faded blue, and the light fixture above is one of those old dusty ceiling fans that creaks when it spins. It's nothing special, but it's mine. I don't spend a lot of time in there, mostly just to sleep. My desk is cluttered with old papers, an old lamp that flickers sometimes, and a stack of books that I've never gotten around to reading. There's a window that overlooks the backyard, and during the summer you can hear the trees swaying in the wind, the soft rustling of leaves that almost sounds like whispers. That night, though, the house felt different. There was something in the air, something off. I couldn't put my finger on it. It was a Friday, and I had just gotten off work. It had been a long day. My legs ached from the hours of lifting heavy boxes, and all I wanted was a hot meal and some time to unwind. I didn't have any plans, nothing to look forward to. It was one of those evenings where the world just feels stagnant, like you're waiting for something to happen, but nothing ever does. I grabbed a frozen pizza from the freezer, tossed it in the oven, and plopped down on the couch. The house was quiet, except for the hum of the fridge and the faint sound of a fan in the corner of the room. The living room was dark, except for the light from the TV. I had just started watching a documentary when my phone buzzed. I picked it up, expecting a text from my mom. She'd been out of town with my dad, but they were expected to be home late that night. Sure enough, it was a text from her. "Lock the doors. We'll arrive late today." I rolled my eyes, shaking my head. My mom had always been the paranoid type. Ever since I was a kid, she'd always made sure to double-check everything before leaving the house, making sure the doors were locked, the windows shut. She didn't like leaving anything to chance. I guess I'd gotten used to it over the years, even if it felt a little excessive sometimes. I didn't think much of it. I locked the front and back doors when I came home from work, just like I always did. The house wasn't exactly in a dangerous area, but I didn't mind doing the extra step. After all, my parents weren't here and I had to look after myself. The night went on as expected. I ate my dinner, watched some TV, and started feeling sleepy around midnight. It wasn't too late, but the house was so quiet, almost too quiet. I switched off the TV, grabbed my phone, and made my way upstairs to bed. The hallway was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the streetlight outside my window. I could feel the chill in the air as I made my way to my room. I never could shake the feeling of being watched when I walked down that hallway. It's not like I thought someone was following me. It was more of a gut feeling, a sense of being exposed, like my every move was being observed from the shadows. I closed the door behind me and locked it, just to be safe. I got into bed and checked my phone again. Another message from my mom, this time asking if I'd locked all the doors. I texted back, telling her that I had. I was about to put my phone down when I heard something. The front door. It was barely a sound at first, just a faint creak. I thought maybe it was just the wind, or maybe I was imagining it. But then I heard it again, louder this time. The sound of a door opening. I froze, my blood running cold. There was no way it could be my parents. They had told me they were going to be late. They wouldn't just show up now. It wasn't them. I felt my stomach twist into knots. I lay there, perfectly still, trying to convince myself that it was nothing. Maybe it was the wind. Maybe the door wasn't fully closed and it just shifted in the breeze. But the more I tried to convince myself, the more I couldn't ignore the feeling creeping up my spine, the sense that something was wrong. Then I heard the footsteps, slow, methodical, almost too deliberate. They were coming from downstairs in the living room, moving steadily toward the stairs. I held my breath, my heart thudding in my chest. My mind was racing. Was I imagining this? It wasn't possible. It couldn't be. I slipped out of bed, my feet silent against the cold hardwood floor. I crept over to my bedroom door and slowly, carefully cracked it open. I couldn't see much in the dark, but I could hear the footsteps now, unmistakable. Someone was in my house. Panic surged through me, and I nearly tripped over my own feet. My hands were shaking, and I felt the overwhelming urge to run, to hide, to get out. But I knew I couldn't. I was trapped here, alone. I had to stay quiet. I rushed back to my bed, grabbed my phone, and dialed 911. It rang once, twice, then the operator answered. 911, what's your emergency? There's someone in my house, I whispered, barely able to form the words. I'm upstairs. I don't know who they are. I don't know what to do. Stay calm, the operator said, her voice steady. Help is on the way. Are you in a safe place? Can you lock the door? I could hear the footsteps getting closer. They were at the base of the stairs now. I could hear them creaking, the sound of someone walking slowly but deliberately. I couldn't tell if it was one person or more. I was already in my room, door locked, but I could hear the doorknob turn. The The sound was soft at first, almost like a whisper. Then it twisted again, harder this time. I pressed my back to the door, holding my breath. I could hear my pulse in my ears, feel the weight of the silence pressing down on me. The operator was still on the line, but her voice felt far away. I didn't dare speak. I couldn't. I needed to stay quiet. Then I heard the sirens. Faint at first, growing louder as they neared the house. I wasn't sure how much time had passed. Seconds? Minutes? It felt like forever. Suddenly, the doorknob rattled again, but this time it didn't stop. I could hear the intruder pulling at it, shaking it violently. But just as quickly, I heard the footsteps retreating, fading into the distance. The sound of the sirens grew louder. The intruder was gone. I stayed frozen, my heart hammering in my chest, my hands still clutching the phone. The operator told me to stay put, that help was outside. Slowly, carefully, I cracked the door open. I saw the flashing lights outside, red and blue, reflecting off the walls. The officers were already inside, making their way through the house, searching every room. But there was nothing. No sign of anyone. No footprints. Nothing to explain what had happened. The only thing I could do was sit there in my room, feeling like I had just narrowly escaped something awful. The police had finished their search and everything appeared to be fine. They couldn't find any sign of the intruder. He was long gone. And even after the police left, I couldn't shake the feeling that the night wasn't over. The silence in the house was suffocating. The officers had done their rounds, checked every door, every window, but something felt off. The air felt heavier, thicker. The way the shadows clung to the corners of my room. The way the quiet seemed too perfect. I tried to sleep, but every creak of the house, every distant sound of wind rattling the shutters made my skin crawl. I could hear my own breathing, shallow and quick, as if I was waiting for something, waiting for it to return. I've been thinking about this for a while, and I honestly still can't get the images out of my head. I'm not sure if sharing this will help me or just make it worse, but if it keeps someone else from going through what I went through, then maybe it'll be worth it. My name's Cody. I'm just your average guy living in a small town in Texas. I've never really been the type to get caught up in the weird or supernatural stuff that people like to talk about around here. I'm a mechanic by trade, and I've been working at the same garage for a few years now. It's nothing fancy, just the usual kind of shop where people bring their beat-up cars for repairs. It's tough work, but it's honest, and it pays the bills. Nothing too exciting ever happens at the shop, so my life's pretty simple and routine. I'm also not someone who gets easily scared. I know that sounds like the type of thing a person says right before something terrifying happens, but trust me, I've always been the calm one in the group. That's why this whole experience still shakes me to my core. Even now, weeks after it happened, I still feel uneasy every time the wind howls outside or when I hear an unfamiliar noise at night. It all started with a sleepover at my buddy Ethan's house. Now, Ethan and I go way back. We've known each other since elementary school, but he's one of those guys who's always been a little off. He's the kind of person who loves creepy horror movies, true crime podcasts, and all that stuff. Me? Not so much. I'm more of a kick back, have a beer, and watch a football game kind of guy. But we still hang out and have fun, even if our interests aren't always the same. So when he invited me to spend the night at his place that weekend, I figured, why not? It was going to be a chill night, just two friends hanging out. Ethan's house was on the outskirts of town, near some old farmland and thick woods. It was a modest ranch-style home, the kind you don't see much anymore. It had a certain charm to it, though. The kind of place where the wooden floors creaked under your feet and the wallpaper was peeling just a little around the edges, but it still felt like home. The place always smelled faintly of pine and old leather. His parents were out of town for the weekend, so it was just me, Ethan, and his dog, Daisy. When I arrived that Friday evening, Ethan greeted me with a big grin, looking like he hadn't a care in the world. We cracked open a couple of beers and started catching up. The living room was cozy, with mismatched furniture that gave the place a lived-in feel. The walls were adorned with old posters of movies Ethan liked, mostly horror flicks from the 80s. The TV sat in the corner, and the coffee table in front of the couch had an assortment of snacks and random junk. An empty pizza box, a few old video game controllers, and a stack of DVDs. As the night wore on, we threw on a couple of movies, mainly ones that made us laugh, like those cheesy slasher films that are more funny than scary. Ethan tried to convince me to watch a documentary about unsolved crimes, but I wasn't in the mood. Instead, we joked around, reminisced about high school, and just enjoyed the quiet of the house. It felt like any other night. By around 11 p.m., we were getting a little drowsy. I don't know if it was the beer or just the long day at work catching up with me, but I wasn't feeling like staying up much longer. Ethan, on the other hand, was still wide awake and kept talking about the creepy things he'd read about on the internet. I wasn't really paying attention, my mind drifting off when he brought up something that caught my attention. "Hey," he said, his voice lowering, "did you hear about that break-in last night?" I blinked, coming back to the conversation. "What break-in?" "Yeah, some guy broke into this house 2 streets over from me. The police are looking for him." That caught my attention. Ethan wasn't the type to get spooked easily, so hearing him talk about it made me curious. "No way. When did this happen?" "Last night, right after the dad came home. They still don't know who he is, but the police said he'd been on their radar for a while. Sounds like it was a real close call." I was about to ask more questions when we heard it. A sharp thud coming from the back door. I froze. I couldn't pinpoint what it was at first, but it definitely wasn't the wind. The house was silent. Too silent. The kind of silence that makes you feel like you're holding your breath. I looked at Ethan, and the fear in his eyes mirrored my own. It wasn't a branch hitting the door or anything like that. No, this was something heavier. "What was that?" I whispered. Ethan didn't respond at first. He just stood up, his eyes wide. "I don't know, but I'm going to check it out." He walked toward the back door, and I followed him, my footsteps heavy. The door led out into the backyard, which was bordered by a wooden fence and thick trees. The kind of place that's peaceful in the daylight, but feels unnervingly quiet at night. The porch light barely illuminated the dark stretch of yard, and the air felt thick with humidity, like it might rain. The only sound was the rustling of the trees, but that thud, it still echoed in my mind. Ethan opened the door, and I stepped outside, my eyes scanning the yard. Nothing seemed out of place. The backyard was exactly how I remembered it from the last time I visited. The old oak tree at the far end, the broken swing hanging from one of its branches, and the overgrown patch of grass near the garden shed. It was all just normal, quiet, too quiet. We crept closer to the fence where the noise seemed to have come from, but there was no one there. "Nothing," Ethan said, his voice tense. Maybe it was an animal or something. I didn't believe that for a second. Ethan stepped inside. "Let's check from the window for a while to be sure," I suggested. Ethan nodded, and we moved quietly toward the kitchen window. The light from inside barely reached the outside, but we could still see through the glass. The moon was low in the sky, casting eerie shadows over the yard. Then, just as I was about to turn away, I saw him. A figure, crouched low beside the window, barely visible in the shadows. At first, I thought my mind was playing tricks on me, but no. The figure was real, a man. His head was tilted, as though he was trying to peek inside without being seen, his movements slow and deliberate. He was wearing dark clothes, and his posture was unnatural, like he was trying to stay as still as possible, as if he was waiting for something, waiting for us to move, waiting for the right moment. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, my breath caught in my throat. Ethan and I Ethan and I exchanged a look, both of us frozen for a second, unsure of what to do. I didn't even know if I should call the cops or try to run. Every instinct in me screamed to get away, but we couldn't move. The man hadn't noticed us yet, and I didn't want to make a sound. And then, just like that, the man seemed to sense something. His head snapped to the side, and his eyes locked on ours through the window. The moment felt like it lasted forever. I couldn't breathe. I didn't know if he'd seen us completely or if he was just waiting for us to act. But in that split second, he straightened up, ducked down, and started backing away. It wasn't until we heard a car pulling into the driveway that we both reacted. Ethan's dad, home earlier than expected, stepped out of the car. The man, realizing he was about to be caught, darted into the shadows and sprinted off toward the woods behind the house. Ethan's dad called out for us, and we ran to meet him. The fear was still thick in the air as we explained what had just happened. The cops came shortly after. They searched the area but didn't find the guy right away. They told us later that he'd been involved in other break-ins in the area, and it was only a matter of time before they caught him. The next day, they found him hiding in a shed a few miles away. He'd broken into a house just down the street the night before, and if Ethan's dad hadn't come home when he did, who knows what would have happened. I still think about that night sometimes. The image of that man crouched by the window haunts me. The whole experience made me realize how fragile safety really is. The world isn't as secure as we like to believe, and sometimes the most unsettling things are the ones that happen when you least expect them. I don't think I'll ever be able to shake the feeling of someone watching, lurking just outside the safety of my own home. I can't help but wonder, what did he want? I don't know. But I'll never forget that night. And if you ever hear a noise in the dark, especially when you're alone at home, trust your instincts. Don't ignore that gut feeling, because sometimes it's trying to tell you something you don't want to know. That's it for today's tale from Shivering Vault. If you have a story worth sharing, drop it in the comments or send it our way. Don't forget to subscribe and share with your fellow thrill seekers. As always, the Shivering Vault thanks you for unlocking today's tale. Until next time, the vault awaits your return.